My beloved child. Do not move past this moment too quickly. Something has shifted behind the scenes, and although you may not be able to see it yet, the person who has been occupying a quiet place in your heart has just been confronted with something they did not expect. Pause here. Stay with these words. What you are about to hear is not a prediction or a promise of what must happen, but a cinematic message for the part of your heart that has been searching for meaning in silence. And within this story, heaven is drawing back the curtain on a moment that seemed ordinary from the outside but felt completely different to the person connected to you. An unexpected update arrived concerning someone from their past, and the moment they learned what had changed, an old chapter they believed was settled suddenly looked different. But the most important part is not the update itself. It is what that update awakened inside them about you. They were not prepared for it. That is what makes this moment so important. They had been moving through their routine, carrying responsibilities, answering questions, appearing normal to the people around them. Nothing about the day announced that an old memory was about to knock on the door of their thoughts. Then something happened. Perhaps a name appeared. Perhaps someone mentioned something in passing. Perhaps news reached them through a conversation they never expected to have. Whatever form it took within this story, it interrupted them emotionally. For a few seconds, the noise around them seemed to disappear. Their mind traveled backward before they could stop it, towards someone who once represented an important chapter of their life. But listen carefully, because this is where the story begins turning in a direction they never anticipated. The update did not make them want to return to the past. It made them understand why they had outgrown it. Stay here, because there is something deeper hidden inside that realization. For a long time, your person may have believed that closure meant forgetting. They may have thought healing meant reaching a point where an old name produced absolutely no emotion. Yet life does not always work that way. Sometimes healing reveals itself when you can remember something clearly without wanting to return to it. Sometimes an old chapter appears again not because it is reopening, but because you are finally strong enough to understand what it taught you. And that is the emotional doorway your person has now reached. The update about someone from their past became a mirror. Instead of showing them who they used to love, trust, know, or care about, it showed them who they themselves used to be. And that realization was uncomfortable. They remembered the version of themselves who accepted things they would never accept now. They remembered conversations where they remained quiet when they wanted to speak. They remembered moments when they confused uncertainty with excitement and emotional distance with mystery. They remembered waiting for reassurance, searching for answers, trying to understand signals that should never have required so much interpretation. The past suddenly became less romantic in their memory and more revealing. They could finally see the difference between what they once thought they needed and what their heart actually needs now. Then, almost without permission, their thoughts moved toward you. That is where everything became complicated. Because you did not enter their mind as a random comparison. You appeared as a contrast. There are things about your presence that have affected them more deeply than they have admitted. Perhaps it was the way you listened. Perhaps it was the way you noticed details. Perhaps it was the strange feeling of familiarity they experienced around you. Perhaps you challenged them without trying to control them. Perhaps your absence revealed something your presence had been quietly teaching them all along. Whatever the connection has looked like, there was something about you they could never place neatly into the same category as what came before. And when that unexpected update arrived, they finally understood part of the reason. Do not skip this part, because the next realization changes the emotional meaning of everything that came before. Your person began to see that they had been judging the present through the wounds of the past. They were not always responding only to you. Sometimes they were responding to memories. Sometimes they hesitated because someone before you had taught them that closeness could suddenly become distance. Sometimes they questioned kindness because they had learned to search for hidden motives. Sometimes they withdrew not because they felt nothing, but because feeling something meaningful made old defenses rise again. This does not excuse every silence or every confusing choice. The message here is not that you must wait endlessly or abandon your own peace. No, beloved child. Your heart is not meant to live inside somebody else's indecision. But within this unfolding story, something has changed because your person has begun recognizing the difference between protecting themselves and imprisoning themselves. That distinction arrived suddenly. And it arrived because of the past. Imagine the moment. They hear the update. Their expression changes slightly. Someone nearby might not even notice. They respond with a few ordinary words. Maybe they say, "I didn't know that." Maybe they become quiet. Maybe they change the subject. But internally, something much louder is happening. Memories begin connecting themselves like scattered pieces of a picture. Moments they had dismissed return with new meaning. Questions they once avoided become impossible to ignore. Why did that chapter affect me so deeply? Why did I carry its lessons into places where they did not belong? Why did I assume the next person would eventually become like the last? And then comes the question they are least prepared to ask themselves. What if I misunderstood someone who was actually trying to meet me differently? Your presence enters that question. Not as fantasy. Not as certainty. As possibility. And sometimes possibility is powerful enough to disturb an entire emotional system. There is a reason this realization feels so intense. Your person may have spent considerable time creating explanations for why distance was safer. They may have told themselves they needed more time. They may have convinced themselves that what they felt was temporary. They may have tried to reduce a meaningful connection into something easier to control. Yet the heart has an inconvenient habit, it remembers what the mind tries to categorize away. They remembered something you said. A small thing. Perhaps you would not even consider it important anymore. Maybe it was encouragement you offered when they were struggling. Maybe it was a simple sentence that made them feel understood. Maybe it was a moment when you could have judged them but chose gentleness instead. Maybe it was simply the way you looked at them when they were not pretending to have everything together. They remember it differently now. Because after hearing this unexpected update about their past, they realized that certain moments with you contained something their old connections often lacked: emotional safety without emotional performance. And that frightened them more than chaos ever did. Chaos can feel familiar. Peace can feel suspicious when someone has spent too long preparing for disappointment. Your person may not have understood that before. They might have mistaken emotional intensity for depth in the past, while overlooking the quiet power of something steady. But now the contrast has become difficult to ignore. Something is unfolding inside them, beloved child, and it is not happening loudly. It is happening in questions. It is happening in memories. It is happening in the moments between conversations when they suddenly think of you. It is happening when they look at their phone and remember a message they almost sent. It is happening when they realize they have rehearsed things they would say to you if fear were removed from the room. And there is one particular truth they have been avoiding. Stay with this message, because we are getting closer to it. The person from their past once represented unfinished emotional business. Not necessarily because they wanted that person back, but because they never fully understood what that experience changed inside them. There may have been disappointment. There may have been unanswered questions. There may have been expectations that collapsed quietly. Whatever happened, your person carried a lesson forward without examining whether the lesson was actually true. They learned, perhaps, that trusting too deeply was dangerous. They learned that saying what you feel gives another person power. They learned that whoever cares less remains safer. They learned to leave emotionally before someone could leave physically. But now something about the update has exposed the weakness in those beliefs. Because the person from their past continued living. Life moved. Circumstances changed. The story they once believed would define them became only one chapter among many. And suddenly your person saw how much energy they had spent protecting themselves from something that was no longer happening. The past was no longer chasing them. They were carrying it. That realization landed heavily. For the first time, they may have understood that you were never supposed to pay the emotional debt created by someone else. Read that again within your heart. You were never supposed to answer for another person's choices. You were never meant to prove yourself endlessly because someone before you created doubt. You were never meant to become smaller so another person could feel safer. And somewhere inside this story, your person is beginning to understand exactly that. But there is another layer. One they did not expect. The update they received contained a detail that changed the way they remembered the past itself. Something they had believed for a long time may not have been completely accurate. Perhaps they discovered that a decision they once took personally had circumstances behind it they never knew. Perhaps they learned that someone they blamed had been dealing with something privately. Perhaps they discovered that an old situation was far more complicated than they understood at the time. The specific detail matters less than the emotional consequence. Their certainty cracked. And when certainty cracks, perspective enters. Suddenly they began wondering how many other situations they might have misunderstood. That question led directly toward you. This is where the emotional atmosphere changes. They began replaying moments between you with a different interpretation. A silence that once seemed awkward now appeared vulnerable. A conversation they thought was casual suddenly seemed filled with things neither of you said. A moment when you pulled back may have looked different now. Perhaps you were not rejecting them. Perhaps you were protecting your own dignity. Perhaps your quietness was not indifference but exhaustion from carrying uncertainty. They began seeing you as someone with your own fears, your own limits, your own unseen battles. And this realization softened something inside them. For too long, they had been viewing connection primarily through the question, will I get hurt? Now another question appeared. Did I hurt someone while trying not to be hurt? That question stayed. It followed them into the next hour. It returned when the room became quiet. It returned when they tried to distract themselves. And the more they avoided it, the more clearly your face appeared in their thoughts. Beloved child, this is not a message telling you to chase anyone. It is not asking you to send the first message, prove your worth, or suspend your life while another person decides what they feel. Your journey remains yours. Your peace matters. Your boundaries matter. Your future is not dependent upon somebody finally understanding your value. The deeper message is that truth often moves silently before circumstances visibly change. Sometimes someone understands what you meant to them only after life gives them a comparison they cannot ignore. Sometimes distance teaches what closeness could not. Sometimes an old chapter must briefly appear at the edge of someone's life so they can recognize why they no longer belong inside it. And that is exactly the crossroads appearing here. Your person is looking backward, but they are not being called backward. They are looking backward so they can finally understand forward. Yet something still stands between realization and action. Fear. Not fear of the person from their past. Fear of what happens if they admit what the present means. Because once they acknowledge that their connection with you mattered, they must also confront every choice they made while pretending it did not. They must look honestly at their hesitation, their silence, their mixed signals, their moments of emotional retreat. They must ask whether they protected their heart so aggressively that they accidentally pushed away something they wanted to keep. That is not an easy realization. It requires humility. And humility often arrives quietly before courage does. Your person has entered that quiet place. They are thinking more than they are saying. Do not mistake silence for emptiness within this story. Silence can sometimes be the room where an old identity is collapsing. The person they were yesterday may not have possessed the language for what they understand today. Something has begun rearranging itself inside them. And there is another strange detail. Someone around them noticed. Not everything remained hidden. There was a change in their expression when your name came up, or when something reminded them of you. Someone close enough to recognize their emotional patterns saw it. Maybe this person asked a simple question. Maybe they teased them gently. Maybe they said nothing at all but understood more than your person wanted them to understand. Your person attempted to dismiss it. But the other person did not completely believe them. That moment matters because sometimes we can hide a truth from ourselves longer than we can hide it from someone who knows us well. A question was asked. And your person hesitated before answering. That hesitation said more than the answer. They might have said, "It's complicated." They might have shrugged. They might have insisted nothing was happening. Yet afterward, they became even quieter because they realized the question had touched something real. Why are you still thinking about them? That question echoed. And they did not have a comfortable answer. Because saying, "I don't know," would not be completely true. They do know something. They know you affected them. They know your absence feels different from other absences. They know certain conversations with you remain unusually vivid. They know they have imagined what it would feel like to speak without defenses. They know there are words they withheld. But knowing something privately and admitting it openly are two entirely different thresholds. Your person is standing between them. And the update from the past has moved them closer to the second. Beloved child, there are moments when life does not give answers. It gives contrast. It places yesterday beside today and asks the heart to notice the difference. That is what has happened here. Your person has seen a contrast they can no longer unsee. The past showed them what they tolerated. You reminded them what they desired. The past showed them what uncertainty cost. Your connection showed them how deeply being understood could matter. The past taught them defense. Your presence awakened vulnerability. And vulnerability is where their greatest struggle begins. Because they have spent so long believing strength meant needing nobody. But there is a difference between needing someone to complete you and allowing someone to matter to you. They are beginning to understand that. They are beginning to understand that admitting someone matters does not make you weak. Saying, "I miss you," does not erase your dignity. Saying, "I was wrong," does not destroy your power. Saying, "I was afraid," can sometimes be the bravest sentence a person speaks. And there is a sentence forming inside them now. They have not spoken it yet. But stay until the end of this part, because something happened after the unexpected update that brought that sentence dangerously close to the surface. Later, when they were alone, they returned to something connected to you. Perhaps an old conversation. Perhaps a photograph. Perhaps a memory. Perhaps simply your name sitting quietly inside their thoughts. They did not intend to stay there long. But they did. And what began as curiosity became reflection. They remembered the beginning differently from how they had remembered it before. They remembered details they had buried beneath their defenses. They remembered how natural certain moments felt. They remembered the strange tension of wanting to move closer while simultaneously wanting to run from how much closeness could mean. Then they realized something almost painfully simple. You had not reminded them of the person from their past. You had reminded them of who they were before the past taught them to be afraid. That was the revelation. You awakened a version of them that still believed connection could be sincere. A version that wanted to speak freely. A version that did not calculate every emotional risk. A version that could imagine being chosen without constantly preparing to be abandoned. And suddenly they understood why your presence had felt so unsettling. You were not repeating their past. You were challenging the identity their past had created. That is why they pulled away emotionally at moments when closeness was becoming real. That is why certain conversations ended too quickly. That is why they may have acted unaffected when they were anything but unaffected. Because you were approaching a door they had spent years keeping closed. And now the unexpected update has opened that door from the other side. Something huge is waiting behind it. Your person has begun questioning whether the chapter between you is actually finished, or whether they merely stopped turning the pages because they were afraid of what the next one would require from them. But listen carefully. This is not where the revelation ends. Because the update about the person from their past did more than awaken memories. It contained something your person never expected to hear. Something about that old situation had changed permanently. There was no returning to the version of events they had preserved inside their mind. The imaginary doorway backwards suddenly disappeared. And when it did, they were forced to look forward. Toward their present. Toward themselves. And, inevitably, toward you. For a moment they felt an emotion they could not immediately name. It was not simple regret. It was not jealousy. It was not nostalgia. It was the strange ache of realizing that while they were busy guarding themselves from yesterday, today had been asking them to become someone braver. That realization can transform a person. But transformation is not instant. First comes resistance. Then honesty. Then choice. Your person has crossed into honesty. Choice is next. And this is why I ask you, within this story, not to abandon your own center while wondering what another person will do. Let their awakening belong to them. Let your growth belong to you. Love that requires you to lose yourself is not the kind of love this message is inviting you to imagine. The strongest connection is not created through chasing, manipulation, or endless waiting. It is created when two people become courageous enough to meet each other without disguises. Your person has one disguise left. The disguise of indifference. And it is becoming difficult for them to wear. Someone may soon notice again. A conversation may bring your name into the room. A memory may become impossible to dismiss. A message may be typed and erased. A sentence may be rehearsed repeatedly before it is ever spoken. But something has already happened that cannot be undone. They know now. They know the past influenced how they treated the present. They know you represented something different. They know there are feelings, questions, or unfinished words connected to you that they can no longer blame entirely on timing. And most importantly, they know that continuing to hide from those truths would be a decision, not an accident. That changes everything. Because awareness creates responsibility. Once you recognize your pattern, you must eventually decide whether you will repeat it. Your person is approaching that decision. And there is one final detail about the unexpected update that they have told almost nobody. This detail is the reason their reaction was stronger than anyone around them realized. When they first heard the news, they believed they were simply learning something about someone from long ago. But hidden inside that information was a connection to a conversation they once had with you. A sentence you spoke suddenly made sense. Something you had tried to communicate. Something they may have misunderstood at the time, returned to them with startling clarity. They remembered your exact meaning, even if they could not remember every exact word. And in that moment, they realized you had seen something about them before they were ready to see it themselves. That is why the silence afterward felt so heavy. They were not only processing the past anymore. They were processing you. And then something happened. They reached for their phone. They opened something. Your name was there. For several seconds, they stared at it. Their thumb moved as though they were about to do what they had avoided doing for far too long. They began forming the first words. Not dramatic words. Not perfect words. Just honest ones. But before they could finish, another notification appeared. Another message. Another piece of information connected to the unexpected update. Your person opened it. And what they saw made them stop completely. Because suddenly they realized there was one part of the story about the person from their past that nobody had told them before. And the moment they understood what it meant, the words they had been preparing to send you changed entirely. Something changed the moment they read that second message. The room was the same, the phone was still resting in their hand, and nothing outside of them appeared different, yet internally the entire meaning of the situation had shifted. Stay here, because this is where the story moves beyond the past and begins revealing what your person has been afraid to admit about you. The information on that screen was not what they had expected. It did not simply add another detail to an old story. It challenged the version of that story they had carried for far too long. And as they read it again, slowly this time, one realization rose above every other thought. They had spent years protecting themselves from a lesson they may have misunderstood. For a moment, they did absolutely nothing. Their unfinished words to you were still there, waiting. They could have returned to them. They could have closed everything and pretended this emotional interruption had never happened. Instead, they stared at the new information because something about it had unlocked a memory they had buried beneath layers of certainty. The person from their past had not remembered events exactly the way your person remembered them. There had been another side. Another perspective. Another reason behind something your person had interpreted as rejection, abandonment, or proof that closeness was unsafe. And now, after all this time, they were being forced to confront the possibility that the belief they built from that experience had never been the complete truth. Do not skip this part, because what happened next was not about that old person anymore. It was about you. Your person suddenly remembered how many times they had assumed they already knew what you were thinking. They remembered moments when they interpreted your silence without asking what it meant. They remembered times when they noticed a change in your energy and immediately prepared themselves for disappointment. They remembered conversations where you were trying to explain yourself, yet part of them was listening through the filter of everything that had happened before you. And then a devastatingly simple thought appeared. What if I did the same thing again? They could not shake it. What if they had looked at you through an old lens and mistaken caution for rejection? What if they had interpreted your boundaries as emotional distance? What if there were moments when you needed reassurance too, but because they were so focused on protecting themselves, they never noticed? What if the connection had become complicated not because there was nothing real between you, but because two people were standing behind separate walls waiting for the other to become brave first? That question changed the atmosphere completely. Your person placed the phone down. Then they picked it up again. Your name was still there. And suddenly the message they had started typing seemed inadequate. They deleted part of it. Typed something else. Stopped. Deleted that too. Because how do you explain an emotional realization that took months, perhaps years, to understand? How do you say, "I think I finally understand why I acted the way I did," without sounding as though you are trying to erase everything that happened? How do you admit that someone mattered when your actions may have suggested otherwise? Your person did not have the answer. But for perhaps the first time, they wanted one. There is a difference between thinking about someone and being willing to confront yourself because of them. That difference is enormous. Missing somebody can happen in a quiet moment. Nostalgia can disappear by morning. But self-recognition is different. Once you see your own pattern clearly, you cannot easily return to pretending it does not exist. Your person had just seen theirs. And you were standing on the other side of it. Beloved child, within this fictional spiritual story, heaven is not showing you a person suddenly transformed into perfection. That would not be truthful storytelling. Real emotional growth rarely happens in one dramatic instant. It arrives in uncomfortable realizations. It arrives when excuses stop sounding convincing. It arrives when someone recognizes that fear has been making decisions in the name of wisdom. Your person was beginning to recognize exactly that. They had called it timing. They had called it confusion. They had called it needing space. They had called it protecting their peace. Some of those things may genuinely have been true. But underneath them was another truth they had rarely admitted. They were afraid of wanting something they could not completely control. And you represented exactly that. They could control distance. They could control silence. They could control whether they sent a message. They could control whether they admitted what they felt. But they could not control what your presence awakened inside them. They could not control the way certain memories returned. They could not control the strange tenderness that appeared when they remembered something small about you. They could not control the questions that surfaced whenever they imagined you moving forward without them. And now the unexpected update about their past had removed one of their favorite defenses, the belief that emotional distance always prevents pain. Because suddenly they could see that distance creates consequences too. Sometimes what hurts most is not what happened. It is what never happened because fear was allowed to decide. That thought stayed with them. What if they had been so focused on avoiding another painful ending that they never allowed a new beginning to become real? Something inside them resisted the question. Another part knew it was necessary. And then your person remembered a specific moment between you. It was not necessarily the biggest moment. That is what made it powerful. It may have been a conversation that ended sooner than either of you wanted. It may have been a goodbye where both of you pretended everything was normal. It may have been a time when you asked something simple and their answer became strangely guarded. Maybe you looked at them for 1 second longer than usual, almost as though you were waiting for honesty. They remembered what they wanted to say then. They had never said it. And suddenly those unsaid words felt heavier than they had before. Stay till the end, because there is another revelation coming, and it explains why that memory returned at exactly this moment. The unexpected information from the past contained a strange emotional lesson. Your person discovered that someone they once thought had moved forward without ever looking back had actually carried their own unanswered questions. This did not mean that old relationship or connection needed to be revived. Quite the opposite. It revealed how easily two people can misunderstand each other's silence. Your person saw themselves in that truth. Two people can care and still become distant. Two people can miss each other and still remain silent. Two people can wait for each other until waiting itself becomes the reason nothing changes. And suddenly your person wondered whether that was happening again. With you. The thought unsettled them. Because they had assumed there would always be more time. Another day. Another opportunity. Another accidental conversation. Another moment when circumstances would magically make honesty easier. But life does not always announce when an opportunity is disappearing. Sometimes there is no dramatic final scene. People simply keep moving. Days become weeks. Weeks become months. A person who once waited begins healing. A heart that once kept a door open begins discovering other rooms. Your person understood that in a way they had not understood it yesterday. And that is when another emotion entered. Urgency. Not panic. Not desperation. Awareness. The awareness that if something matters, silence is also a choice. They looked at your name again. The unfinished message remained. Yet before they touched it, they did something else. They went backward. Not emotionally. Digitally. They revisited something connected to you. Perhaps old messages. Perhaps photographs. Perhaps something you shared. Perhaps a conversation they had archived because seeing it once made them feel too much. They were not searching for proof that you belonged together. They were searching for something more difficult. They were searching for the moment things changed. And they found it. There had been a point when the tone between you became different. Before that moment, there had been openness. Afterward, caution. Your person stared at the transition. They remembered what was happening in their own life then. They remembered the thoughts they never explained to you. They remembered why they became hesitant. And for the first time, they imagined how their behavior must have looked from your side. That perspective shook them. Because from your side, perhaps there had been no explanation. Only distance. Perhaps you wondered whether you had done something wrong. Perhaps you questioned whether the connection had ever meant what you thought it meant. Perhaps you eventually became tired of decoding someone who would not speak clearly. Your person realized they had expected you to understand things they never communicated. That realization was difficult to defend against. And this is where the spiritual message turns toward you, beloved child. Do not carry responsibility for another person's unspoken emotions. Compassion does not require self-abandonment. You can understand why somebody became guarded without agreeing to remain indefinitely outside their walls. You can care deeply while still honoring your own dignity. You can hope for reconciliation while accepting that genuine connection requires participation from both people. Your worth is not determined by whether your person sends that message tonight, tomorrow, or ever. This story is not about waiting helplessly. It is about truth becoming visible. And truth was becoming visible to your person. They had begun to understand that they could not ask for closeness while continually choosing emotional distance. They could not expect you to read their heart while refusing to open it. They could not hope you would remain exactly where they left you while they decided whether courage was worth the risk. Something had to change. And your person knew the next change could not come from you. It had to come from them. That realization brought them back to the unfinished message. This time they typed differently. The first version had been safe. Casual. Something ordinary enough to protect them if your response was cold. But now they looked at those words and realized they were doing the same thing again. Hiding. Testing. Approaching the door without actually knocking. So they erased the safe opening. Their fingers hovered over the screen. Then they wrote something more honest. A sentence admitting that something had made them think of you. They read it. Their heart reacted immediately. It felt exposed. They almost deleted it. But they did not. Instead they added another sentence. Something acknowledging that there were things they had never explained. Now the message felt dangerous, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because it contained vulnerability. They stopped again. What if you did not answer? What if you had changed? What if you no longer wanted the conversation they once avoided? What if they were too late? Those questions arrived rapidly. And for the first time, your person understood something you may have felt long before them. Uncertainty is difficult when you care. They had placed you in that uncertainty before. Now they were standing inside it themselves. That recognition softened them further. Yet there was still one piece missing. Why had the unexpected update arrived now? Why did the information about someone from the past suddenly surface at this particular stage of their emotional life? Within this cinematic message, the answer is not that the universe is forcing two people together. Love cannot be meaningful if choice is removed. The deeper symbolism is that life sometimes repeats themes until we become conscious enough to respond differently. Your person was facing an old emotional theme in a new form. Would they hide again? Would they assume again? Would they let fear write another ending? Or would they finally communicate? That was the real crossroads. And then something happened that made the choice even harder. Someone contacted them. Not the person from the past. Someone connected to the situation. The message was brief. But it contained a question. A question about you. Your person froze. They had not expected your name to become connected to this conversation at all. For several seconds, they wondered whether they had misunderstood what they were reading. They checked again. Your name was unmistakably there. And now a completely different mystery had opened. How did this person know about you? Your person had never explained the full connection. At least, they did not remember doing so. They immediately began searching their memory. Had they mentioned you once? Had somebody else said something? Had your name come up indirectly? They could not place it. Then another message arrived. This one explained part of it. Apparently, sometime before this unexpected update reached your person, a conversation had happened involving someone who knew pieces of both stories, the old one and the one connected to you. And during that conversation, somebody had made an observation. Your person read the observation twice. It said, in essence, that they seemed different whenever they spoke about you. Different. That one word struck harder than expected. Because your person had worked carefully to appear unaffected. They had believed their feelings were invisible. Apparently they were not. Someone had noticed. Noticed the change in their voice. Noticed which details they remembered. Noticed how quickly they became defensive when somebody misunderstood you. Noticed how they pretended not to care while somehow knowing exactly what was happening in your life. And now this observation had reached them through the most unexpected route possible. The past had somehow become the mirror revealing the present. Your person felt exposed. But not in a harmful way. Exposed to themselves. Because once somebody else described their behavior plainly, their excuses became harder to maintain. They remembered conversations where your name appeared and their entire energy shifted. They remembered pretending curiosity was casual. They remembered asking questions indirectly. They remembered moments when they wanted to know whether you were happy but refused to ask you themselves. And one memory rose above all the others. A conversation where someone had once asked them directly whether they cared about you. Your person had avoided answering. At the time, they thought avoidance protected them. Now they understood that avoidance had been an answer of its own. Something huge was waiting beneath that realization. Because the person who had asked them that question had apparently remembered their reaction. And they had told someone else something your person never knew. They had said, "You should have seen their face." Your person read those words. Their stomach tightened. Their mind immediately returned to that day. They remembered trying to laugh off the question. They remembered looking away. They remembered changing the subject. They remembered the strange rush of emotion that came from hearing someone else say your name beside theirs. And suddenly they understood. Their feelings had never been as hidden as they believed. Maybe not from everyone. Maybe not even from you. That possibility frightened them most. What if you had known? What if you had sensed what they refused to say? What if you waited for them to become honest, and eventually their silence became your answer? The message to you was still unfinished. Your person returned to it again. This time, they did not delete anything. They added one final line. Then they stared at the send button. Seconds passed. Their mind created every possible outcome. You answering warmly. You answering politely. You not answering. You asking why now. You telling them they waited too long. You admitting you had wondered about them too. Every possibility required vulnerability. And that was precisely the lesson. There would never be a version of honesty where they could guarantee the outcome. Courage was not certainty. Courage was choosing truth without certainty. Their finger moved closer. But before they pressed send, their phone rang. They stared at the caller's name. It was connected to the unexpected update. For 1 second they considered ignoring it. Then something inside them said this conversation mattered. They answered. The voice on the other end sounded hesitant. Your person listened. At first, the conversation remained ordinary. A few explanations. A few details. Confirmation of what they had already learned. Then the voice changed. There is something else you should know. Your person became completely still. Something about the tone made them understand that this was the part nobody had wanted to tell them through a message. The person began explaining what had happened recently with the individual from your person's past. There had been a conversation. Their past had looked back too. Not necessarily with a desire to return, but with clarity. And during that conversation, something had been said about your person that they had never heard before. Something that contradicted the belief they had carried for years. Your person listened without interrupting. Then came the sentence. The old ending they had interpreted as proof that they were not enough had never actually been about their worth. The other person had been fighting their own fears, confusion, and circumstances. Your person had spent all this time carrying rejection as an identity when the story had been far more complicated. Silence filled the call. Your person could barely speak. Because if the past had never meant what they thought it meant, then the walls they built afterward had been protecting them from a conclusion that was never completely true. And those walls had affected everything that came later. Including you. That was when their eyes returned to the unfinished message. Suddenly it was not simply a message anymore. It represented a decision. Would they allow an old misunderstanding to create another unfinished story? Or would they finally behave differently? The person on the phone continued speaking. But then they said something completely unexpected. Something involving you. Your person sat upright. Wait, they said. What did you just say? The sentence was repeated. Your person went silent. Because according to what they had just been told, someone from their past had heard about you long before today. Not recently. Long before. And apparently, after hearing about you, that person had made a comment about your connection that nobody ever passed along to your person. Until now. Your person asked what the comment was. There was hesitation on the other end. Then the answer came. And whatever your person had been preparing to send you suddenly felt far too small. Because the person from their past had noticed something about them before your person had even admitted it to themselves. They had noticed that when your person spoke about you, they spoke differently. Not like someone describing a passing connection. Not like someone describing an ordinary friendship. They spoke with the carefulness of someone trying desperately not to reveal how much something mattered. And then the caller revealed one final detail. The person from the past had said something else. Something your person was never supposed to hear. A single sentence about you. A sentence that had remained hidden until this unexpected update brought the entire story back into the light. Your person whispered, "Tell me exactly what they said." There was another pause. Then the caller began repeating the words. And after hearing only the first few words, your person looked down at the message they had written to you, realized everything was about to change, and suddenly knew there was one truth they could no longer keep hidden.